the news that General Motors will close multiple factories and lay off more than 14,000 workers. President Trump is renewing his threat to impose tariffs on auto imports. Yesterday, the president tweeted, quote, "The reason the small truck business in the U.S. is such a go-to favorite is that for many years, tariffs of 25% have been put on small trucks coming into our country. It is called the chicken tax. If we did that with cars coming in, many more cars would be built here, and GM would not be closing their plants in Ohio, Michigan, and Maryland. Get smart, Congress. Also, the countries that send us cars have taken advantage of the U.S. for decades. The president has great power on this issue because of the GM event. It is being studied now." The president has been threatening auto tariffs for months, you'll remember, mainly as a negotiation tool for his other trade battles, despite his assertion that it was due to GM. In addition, while Trump says he has, quote, great power, the only way the White House can impose tariffs on auto imports is if the Commerce Department concludes the current level of imports poses a national security threat. Right after the president's tweets, shares of General Motors fell to their lows on the day. Joining us now, reporter for The Washington Post, Eugene Scott, and former Treasury official and Morning Joe economic analyst Steve Rattner. He's out with a new op-ed in this morning's New York Times. Trump is wrong about the General Motors bailout. Steve, good morning. Good to see you. Eugene, welcome. We should point out where the cars are under President Obama, helping bail out companies like GM and to get them through that difficult time. The president's tweets, first of all. Go.
For some charts? You ready for some
charts? The factual accuracy of what the president
So let's
saying.
actually, coincidentally, the very first chart addresses the president's tweet about foreign imports. And the fact of the matter is that foreign imports have actually stayed remarkably stable over several decades, hovering in this 20 to 30% range. And so, in fact, there is no immediate upsurge in imports or anything like that that is really causing this problem. GM's issues stem from some other factors that we can talk about.
So the president's tweets are completely off base. Is there anything in there that you can sink your teeth into?
Look, we have imposed 25% tariffs on imports of foreign what they call light trucks, SUVs, right, and things like that to protect our market. The Europeans do the same thing. Sure, we could change all that, but the fact is, look, we don't import any cars from China. We don't. It's a myth. The president talked about closing plants in China that belong to GM. Those produce cars for the GM market. We don't bring them here. So what we're going to talk about this morning is not related to imports. The problems come from other directions.
And so GM is now changing its model they're making the wrong kind of cars for many years, and they have to change that to remain viable.
Well, what's happened, if we look at the next chart, is that consumer tastes have changed. And some of that is a function of gas prices, some of that is a function of personal habits. But you can see that the share of sales that go to cars has been declining steadily for a long time. And meanwhile, the share of cars that goes to SUVs, we call light trucks, but they're really SUVs, has been rising steadily. And so the problem is that GM does not make exactly what consumers want to buy. Those consumers who are switching to SUVs, they're not buying Chevy Suburbans. They're looking for Hondas. They're looking for Toyota RAV4s. They're looking for these crossover vehicles where GM isn't as strong. So when you look at the plants GM is closing, they fall into two buckets. Car plants, because Americans aren't really buying cars as much anymore, and engine and transmission plants, because as we go to electric cars and new kinds of cars, you don't need to make transmissions anymore. And so they're really positioning themselves as much for the future.
So what could the Trump administration actually do to help the problem instead of Donald Trump tweeting out factually inaccurate tweets that have no basis in reality?
Well, one of Donald Trump's tweets was exactly the opposite of what you'd want to do. He tweeted out that we should take all the electric car subsidies away from General Motors. The whole point of the exercise is to get General Motors and the other car companies to make more electric cars, not fewer electric cars. So his idea of a policy response is more or less the opposite of what you or I would do if we were trying to respond to this problem. GM is working through it. Look, car sales are starting to flatten out. Miles driven are starting to flatten out. We're at a time of enormous disruptive change in the auto industry. And I think while GM is not perfect, I think they're trying to get ahead of the curve in terms of what's really going on, as opposed to putting their head in the sand the way they did before they got in trouble.
Eugene Scott, we're talking about cars and car sales and what's happening to General Motors, but out in Lordstown, Ohio, there are people who have been working 3 shifts down to 2 shifts, down to 1 shift, and now no more shifts. And I can't help but thinking about the number of men and women who have worked there and lived there all their lives, who might be 50 to 55 years of age, now have no job or will soon have no job with GM. This is exactly the barrel of voters that Donald Trump went after, attracted, and got to vote for him with his promises, and now they're back on the street again. This is a sad human story.
Absolutely, and these are the people you have to think about. We know that Trump won Ohio, and Trump won Ohio in part because he told these voters that he would never close not even one single plant. We knew that he did not have full control over that, but many voters did not understand that. And he's running his re-election campaign based on the slogan, promises kept. But what this shows is that promises have not, in fact, been kept, in part because these are promises that the president perhaps should not have made because he does not have complete control over them. And he's telling his voters that the problem exists because of some things that aren't true. The reality is fewer people are buying cars in the United States, in part because most of the population lives in urban areas. They're taking rideshare, they're taking transportation. These spaces are more walkable. Families are smaller and less dependent on cars. And instead of blaming international governments and businesses for taking away jobs from American workers, the president perhaps should have said, maybe I should not have made these promises. Maybe I should have encouraged these voters to pursue other career opportunities and let them know that I could develop their communities economically without presenting falsities and creating international enemies.
So, Steve, in your op-ed in the New York Times this morning, you quote the president on the campaign trail in Detroit in 2016 as saying, "My plan includes a pledge to restore manufacturing in the United States," a central promise of his campaign. You call later in the piece a false promise was false hope, a cynical campaign pledge divorced from economic reality. What is the reality about auto jobs in America right now?
The reality about jobs in autos and in manufacturing is that they have been growing. We can look at this very last chart, and you can see that in autos, from the nadir of the recovery down here in 2009, they did grow quite steadily, but never back anywhere to where they were before. And in fact, under Trump, we've only added 434,000 auto jobs, a slower pace than under Obama. And the rate of that increase is very much slowing. And I think when you start to factor in things like the GM layoffs, you may even see it turn down. But for all the factors that we've been discussing this morning, are overarching issues facing the industry, which makes Donald Trump's campaign promise, as I said, a bit of wishful thinking, because we are not going to be able to restore that kind of level of manufacturing in this country. We can do some things better, but
what does slackening car sales tell us, if anything, about the larger economy?
That's a great question, Mike. Look, first of all, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in cars. People are driving fewer miles, they're buying fewer cars, they're doing ride sharing, they're doing other kinds of things. But that said, car sales, we're in the late stages of an economic recovery. We've been at a high level of car sales for a long time. Affordability is going down because as interest rates go up, most cars are financed in this country. They don't buy as many. And so, yes, it starts to feel like it's a part of an overall fragility in this economy that is a little bit worrisome.
All right, still ahead on Morning Joe, in a strong rebuke of President Trump, the Senate votes to advance a bill that would end all U.S. involvement in the Saudi-led war in Yemen. What it means for U.S. relations with Saudi Arabia when Morning Joe comes right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.